The scent of funeral lilies mingled with the sharp metallic tang of cold incense in the vestibule of St. Jude's. It was a fragrance of finality, one that Lydia Whitmore found appropriate, though the occasion was technically a celebration of union. The air inside the stone nave was 4 degrees colder than the autumn morning outside, a damp chill that seeped through the thin soles of her boots and settled into her marrow. She did not shiver. She did not adjust the door that clung to her shoulders with the desperation of a drowning man. She stood at the threshold of the center aisle and waited for the usher to notice her, her spine a perfectly vertical line that defied the gravity of her circumstances. To any casual observer, she was merely a guest of declining fortune, but to Lydia, the church was not a house of God, it was a ledger of social debts, and today the accounts were being settled in blood and silk. The whispers began before she had taken a single step toward the pews. They were not loud, but they were precise, cutting through the low hum of the organ like a razor through fine linen. Lydia did not turn her head. She did not acknowledge the rhythmic flickers of lace fans, or the way the ladies in the third row leaned toward one another to share a morsel of scandal. She had practiced this silence in the dark rooms of her family's crumbling estate, auditing the silence until it became a shield. Mrs. Gables sat near the back, her hat a feathered monstrosity that seemed to tremble with the intensity of her curiosity. As Lydia passed, the older woman's gaze traveled the length of Lydia's gown with the clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating a carcass. The dress was a deep, muted plum, a shade that had been fashionable 3 seasons ago. It was known in the village as last year's lace, and while the fabric was worn thin at the elbows, every stitch of the intricate needlework had been reinforced by Lydia's own ink-stained fingers. The lace was not a garment of vanity. It was a fortress of mended dignity, held together by threads of stubbornness and the refusal to disappear. She did not rush her pace. She did not lower her eyes. She counted the stones beneath her feet, 24 until the midpoint, 48 until the family pews, and measured the temperature of the room by the condensation on the stained glass windows. Behind her, Mrs. Gables' voice carried just far enough to sting. It was a shame. The woman remarked to her companion that some people did not know when to decline an invitation. To attend the wedding of the man who had traded one's hand for a larger dowry was not an act of strength, it was an act of public insolvency. Lydia heard the word insolvency and felt a familiar, cold satisfaction. They thought she was bankrupt of pride because she was bankrupt of gold, but they did not understand the nature of her capital. She found a seat in the shadow of a grey marble pillar, a position that allowed her to see everything while remaining partially obscured. From here, the altar was a stage of white roses and flickering tallow. She watched the arrival of the Pemberton family, Clarissa's relatives who moved with the heavy, unearned confidence of those whose wealth was measured in acres rather than character. Clarissa Pemberton would be arriving soon, draped in the spoils of her father's successful shipping ventures, a bride whose value was calculated to the penny in the marriage contract Lydia had seen by accident on her father's desk 6 months prior. Lydia reached into her reticule and touched the small, leather-bound notebook she carried everywhere. It was a habit of the mind, a need to record, to categorize, to balance. She did not open it, for that would be a breach of etiquette she could not afford, but the tactile sensation of the smooth leather grounded her. She began an internal audit of the room. There were 12 floral arrangements of questionable taste. There were 84 guests, at least 30 of whom were carrying debts that would remain unpaid by the year's end. And then there was Julian Thorne. He appeared at the front of the church, standing beside the altar with a posture that suggested he had never known the weight of a failing harvest or the terror of a closing ledger. Julian was a man of fine edges and shallow depths, his waistcoat a shimmering cream that reflected the candlelight. He looked toward the door, his eyes bright with the anticipation of his new life, a life built on the foundations of the betrayal he had served to Lydia over tea on a rainy Tuesday in April. He avoided glancing toward the shadow of the marble pillar. He did not need to. In his mind, Lydia Whitmore had already been erased, a minor debt written off to make room for a more profitable investment. The organ shifted its tone, the low, mournful chords ascending into a triumphant march that signaled the bride's approach. The congregation rose as one, a sea of silk and wool that obscured Lydia's view. She rose with them, her hands folded over her reticule, her expression as unreadable as a blank page. She watched Clarissa Pemberton sweep down the aisle, a cloud of white lace and artificial innocence. Clarissa did not look like a woman who had spent the last month spreading rumors about Lydia's family's debts. She looked like a queen, and the church was her kingdom. The ceremony was a blur of recited vows and hollow promises, a mechanical performance of devotion that tasted of dust and lavender. Lydia listened to Julian's voice, the same voice that had once promised her the stewardship of his heart, as he pledged himself to Clarissa's fortune. It was a matter of contracts, not of emotions. She counted the seconds between the prayers, the ticking of the clock in the bell tower, echoing the steady beat of her own pulse. When the final blessing was given and the new Mr. and Mrs. Thorne turned to face the crowd, Lydia felt the air in the church grow even colder. As the guests began to file out toward the reception at Pemberton Manor, the atmosphere shifted from solemnity to a predatory kind of glee. The real sport was about to begin. Lydia waited until the pews were nearly empty before she stepped back into the aisle. She had fulfilled her social obligation. She had shown the village that she could witness the union, without a public display of grief. She intended to slip away before the festivities reached their peak, but the geography of the church worked against her. In the narrow vestibule, the crowd had bottlenecked, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and excessive perfume. Lydia found herself pinned against the stone wall near the heavy oak doors. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the light of the doorway, but the path was blocked by a group of young men in expensive coats, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. At the center of the group stood Julian, his arm draped around Clarissa's waist as they accepted the congratulations of their peers. Lydia attempted to move past them, her movements small and precise, a silent navigation of the social reef. She almost made it to the door when a hand reached out and caught the sleeve of her gown. It was not a violent gesture, but it was an arresting one. The fingers snagging on the delicate mended lace of her cuff, she stopped and turned, her eyes meeting Julian's. His smile did not reach his eyes. It was the grin of someone who had won a game and could not resist the urge to remind his opponent of their loss. Beside him, Clarissa tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over Lydia's plum-colored dress with a look of theatrical sympathy. "Lydia," Julian said, his voice loud enough to silence the nearby conversations. "I was not certain you would find the courage to attend. It is a long walk from the Whitmore estate, and I imagine your carriage horses have seen better days. Or perhaps they have been sold to settle the interest on your father's gaming debts." The laughter that followed was short and sharp, like the barking of hounds. Lydia did not flinch. She did not pull her arm away. She looked at Julian's hand on her sleeve, the hand that was currently straining the integrity of her mended lace. And then she looked him directly in the eyes. "The horses are well, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice level and clear. "They are, at the very least, consistently loyal. A quality that is becoming increasingly rare in this county, wouldn't you agree?" Julian's face flushed a dull, angry red. The insult was subtle enough to be ignored in polite company, but the guests were no longer interested in being polite. They were hungry for a scene. Clarissa stepped forward, her silk skirts rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She reached out and touched the lace on Lydia's cuff, her fingers lingering on a tiny, meticulously repaired tear. "Oh, Julian!" "Do not be so harsh," Clarissa said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Lydia has clearly gone to great lengths to present herself today. This lace, is it not the same pattern your mother wore to the harvest ball 5 years ago? It is so. Vintage. It must be a struggle, Lydia, to maintain the appearance of a lady when the substance has quite literally fallen away. We were just discussing the state of your library. I hear the Pemberton bailiffs are expected there by the end of the week." The circle of guests drew closer, their faces illuminated by the grey light filtering through the doorway. Lydia felt the cold stone of the church behind her, the physical boundary of her isolation. She was alone. No, she was observed. She was being measured for her worth, and the verdict had already been reached. She looked at Clarissa, seeing not a bride, but a woman whose power was borrowed from her father's ledgers and her husband's greed. "The library remains in my care," Lydia said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the cool, authoritative tone of a steward. "And as for the lace, Mrs. Thorne, it was crafted by hand, not purchased in bulk from a merchant's discard pile. There is a difference between value and price. I suspect you will learn the distinction quite soon, perhaps when the interest rates on your husband's hidden debts begin to climb. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's grip on her sleeve tightened, the threads of the lace finally beginning to groan under the pressure. His eyes darted to the guests around them, his facade of wedding day bliss cracking to reveal the insecure social climber beneath. He opened his mouth to deliver a final, crushing blow, something that would strip away the last of Lydia's dignity in front of the entire parish. "It is a pity, Lydia," he sneered, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper, "that you think your clever words can hide the fact that you are a beggar in a dead woman's clothes. You are a ghost, haunting a wedding you were never meant to have. Look at yourself. You have nothing. No dowry, no husband, and soon, no roof. You are in insolvency, and the world is tired of carrying your debt." Lydia felt the sting of the words, the cold logic of his cruelty hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She did not cry. She did not run. She stood, her spine as straight as a ruler, and prepared to walk out into the rain with her head held high, even if it was the last thing she ever did. She counted the heartbeats of the crowd, waiting for the laughter to resume, waiting for the final shove that would cast her out into the mud of the churchyard. But the laughter did not come. Instead, a shadow fell over the vestibule, a sudden, heavy presence that seemed to swallow the light. The crowd parted instinctively, a wave of silken skirts and wool coats retreating as if from a sudden frost. Lydia felt a shift in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the stone walls. A man stepped into the circle, his movements slow and deliberate, the silver head of his cane clicking against the floor with the precision of a metronome. He was dressed in black of such high quality it made Julian's cream waistcoat look like cheap muslin. His face was a mask of aristocratic boredom, his eyes a winter grey that seemed to audit the very souls of those he looked upon. It was Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood, the man the village called the feared Duke, not because of his cruelty, but because of his absolute, unshakable competence and the silence that followed him like a loyal hound. He spared no glance for the bride. He refused to look at the groom. He stared at the hand Julian Thorne still had clamped around Lydia's arm. "Mr. Thorne," the Duke said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried the weight of centuries of authority. "You are wrinkling the lady's lace. I suggest you release her before I am forced to consider the financial implications of your lack of restraint." Julian's hand dropped as if he had been burned. The wedding guests fell back, their whispers replaced by a sudden frantic silence. Lydia stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat as the most powerful man in the county turned his gaze toward her. In that moment, the church was no longer a stage for Julian's cruelty. It was the site of a new, far more dangerous calculation. The silence that followed the Duke's command was not empty. It was a dense, pressurized thing, filled with the collective indrawn breath of 84 guests. Lydia did not exhale. She did not allow her shoulders to slump. The sudden absence of Julian Thorne's fingers on her arm offered a physical relief, yet her skin still hummed with the insult of his touch. The nobleman did not move his gaze from Julian. He stood like a monument of black wool and cold iron, his cane held at an angle that suggested it could be used as a blunt instrument or a scepter with equal ease. "Mr. Thorne," Arthur repeated, his voice dropping into a register that made the loose stones of the vestibule seem to vibrate. "I find that silence is often the best defense for a man of your precarious standing. However, when it comes to Miss Whitmore, your silence is no longer requested. It is required." Julian's mouth worked soundlessly, his eyes darting toward Clarissa Pemberton, who had retreated several steps. The bride's silk skirts, so triumphantly loud moments ago, now seemed to shrink against the grey stone of the church. The Duke did not acknowledge her. He did not acknowledge the congregation that peered over the pews like curious cattle. He turned his body with a slow, deliberate grace, facing Lydia. The height of him was an intimidation in itself. Arthur was not merely a man of rank. He was a presence that occupied the air around him, displacing the trivialities of the wedding as if they were nothing more than dust. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, searched her face. He sought no tears. He expected no plea for help. He studied her straight spine, the meticulously mended fabric of the faded lace at her cuff, and the way her fingers remained steady against her reticule. He stepped closer, moving into the private radius of her isolation. The scent of him was different from the church. It was not incense and decay, but crisp paper, old leather, and the faint, sharp tang of cedar. He inclined his head, his lips coming close to the shell of her ear. The movement was so sudden, so intimate, that the whispers in the vestibule surged and then died a second death. "Pretend you are with me," the Duke whispered. The words were a low vibration, a secret shared beneath the roar of social condemnation. He did not wait for her to gasp. He did not wait for her to blush. "Do not argue. Do not explain. Simply give me your hand, and let the ledger of this morning be rewritten." The calculation of the moment clicked into place with mathematical precision. She was an auditor of reality. She saw the trade being offered. On one side of the scale was the public ruin Julian had intended for her, a slow, painful social death in a plum-colored dress. On the other was an alliance with a man feared by the very people who now mocked her. Arthur was not offering a hand of kindness. He was offering a contract of protection. It was a matter of strategy, not of emotion. She looked up at him. She did not smile. She did not feign the flutter of a rescued maiden. She looked at the Duke with the same clarity she used to evaluate a failing harvest. She saw the hardness in his jaw, the absolute certainty in his grey eyes, and the way he held himself apart from the world. She reached out her hand, her ink-stained fingers, the skin slightly rough from hours of stitching and ledger work, came to rest on the fine black wool of his sleeve. She felt the rigid muscle beneath the heavy cloth, a physical manifestation of the immovable authority he carried. The touch was not a gesture of affection. It was a signature on a binding agreement of mutual benefit. "I believe we are expected at the reception, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying across the vestibule with the precision of a bell. It would be a pity to keep Clarissa and her family waiting for the guest of honor. His lips did not curve, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, of a fellow architect in a world of mere decorators. He turned back to the crowd, his hand covering hers on his arm. The sterling signet, a heavy weight of gold, caught the grey light of the doorway. "My apologies, Mr. Thorne," the Duke said, his voice now cold and expansive. "I neglected to inform the parish that Miss Whitmore attended this ceremony as my intended companion. Her presence here was a courtesy to your past association, but her future remains entirely under my stewardship." The shock that rippled through the church was a physical thing. Julian's face went from red to a sickly pale grey, his eyes fixed on the Duke's hand over Lydia's. Clarissa's hand flew to her throat, her fingers clutching the pearls that now seemed like cheap beads in the presence of such absolute authority. The solid weight of the nobleman's lead guided the young woman forward as he began to move. He did not rush. He did not weave through the crowd. The congregation parted for them as if they were a blade cutting through silk. She walked beside him, her head held at the same precise angle as before, but the temperature of the world had changed. She was no longer a beggar in a dead woman's clothes. She was the woman at the side of the Duke of Blackwood, and the meticulously mended lace on her arm was no longer a symbol of poverty. It was a badge of his favor. The transition from the cold, damp stone of St. Jude's to the opulent ballroom of Pemberton Manor was a shift in the grammar of their surroundings. The manor was a house of excess, of gilded cornices and the cloying scent of forced hothouse lilies. It was an estate that tried too hard to prove its worth. The Duke did not seem to notice the grandeur. To him, the house was merely a set of coordinates, a physical space to be navigated and controlled. He led Lydia through the foyer, ignoring the servants who bowed with a desperation that bordered on terror. The whispers followed them, a rhythmic tide of confusion that broke against his broad shoulders. The ballroom was already filling with the wedding guests, the air thick with the smell of expensive sherry. At the far end of the room, the head table had been set upon a raised dais, a landscape of silver plate and crystal that shimmered under the light of 100 candles. A palpable shift altered the atmosphere of the room the moment they stepped over the threshold. The laughter died down. Every eye in the room traveled the length of the Duke's black coat before settling on the plum-colored dress of his companion. She did not falter. She focused on the ticking of the long-case clock in the corner, a steady, mechanical pulse that reminded her that time was a ledger that could always be balanced. "Arthur," a voice called out, sharp and brittle. It was Clarissa's father, Mr. Pemberton, a man whose face was a mask of forced joviality. "We did not expect, that is to say, we are honored, but surely there has been a mistake in the seating. We had not counted on such a distinguished addition to the wedding party." Mr. Pemberton's gaze flickered to Lydia. He saw the worn fabric of her faded sleeves. He saw the daughter of a man he had helped to bankrupt. He saw a debt he thought had been written off, now standing before him demanding to be paid in full. "There is no mistake, Mr. Pemberton," Arthur said, his voice level and final. "Miss Whitmore will be seated with me at the head table. I believe the position to the right of the host is currently vacant, or perhaps it can be made so." A sharp intake of breath hissed from the guests nearest to them. The head table was a sanctuary of status that the auditor had been explicitly excluded from in her invitation. To place her, there was not just an honor, it was a displacement. It was the social equivalent of a hostile takeover. Mr. Pemberton hesitated, his eyes darting toward the dais where Julian and Clarissa were just beginning to take their seats. Julian was staring at them, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his face a mask of impotent rage. "Of course, Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton stammered, stepping back. "Whatever you require, you there, reorder the place settings at once." The Duke did not wait for the servant to finish. He led his companion toward the dais, his steps rhythmic and sure. They ascended the 3 small steps to the head table. He reached out and pulled back a heavy chair, waiting for her to seat herself before he took the place beside her. Lydia sat down, the velvet of the chair cool against her back. She looked across the table. Directly opposite her sat the bride and groom. The distance between them was less than 4 feet, yet it felt like a canyon. Julian's hands were clenched under the table, the knuckles white. He looked at her, searching for the shame he had seen in the vestibule, searching for the beggar he had mocked. He found nothing. Lydia bore no resemblance to a woman who had been rescued. She appeared as one who had just concluded a successful audit of her own worth. She picked up her linen napkin, her movement small and precise, and placed it across her lap. The fabric was stiff with starch, completely unlike the thin, worn cotton of her own belongings. But she handled it as if she had been born to such excess. She examined the silver fork beside her plate, the Pemberton crest engraved on the handle, and realized it was not a tool for eating. It was a witness to her survival. The Duke's hand was not a gesture of comfort. It was a binding contract of social immunity. He sat beside her, his icy gray gaze surveying the room with a clinical detachment that silenced the nearby conversations. He reached for his wineglass, the sterling signet catching the candlelight, and turned his head slightly toward Lydia. "A matter of positioning, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "In estate management, as in the ballroom, one must always control the high ground. The view from here is quite instructive, wouldn't you agree?" She looked out over the ballroom. She saw Mrs. Gable in the 3rd row of tables, her feathered hat now sagging as she whispered frantically to her neighbor. She saw the young men who had laughed at her in the church, now looking at their plates. Their bravado evaporated. She saw the power of the Duke's silence, a silence that had transformed her threadbare gown into a garment of mystery and prestige. "The view is illuminating, Arthur," she replied, her voice steady and quiet. "It seems the interest on certain social debts is much higher than Mr. Thorne anticipated." The nobleman looked at her, then a long, unblinking stare that seemed to measure the depth of her mind. He did not offer a compliment. He did not mention her beauty. He looked at her, as if she were a complicated ledger he was seeing for the first time, one that contained secrets he had not yet decoded. "We shall see how the accounts settle by the end of the evening," he said, dipping his head in a silent acknowledgement. "For now, Miss Whitmore, I suggest you enjoy the soup. I am told the Pemberton cook is one of the few things in this house that is actually worth the price paid." Lydia picked up her spoon. She paid no heed to Julian. She ignored Clarissa. She studied the clear golden broth in her bowl as the warmth of the room finally began to reach her. She had been humiliated at the altar of her past, but she was now presiding over the feast of her future. The ledger of her life was no longer in the red. She had found an ally who understood the value of silence, and together they were about to rewrite the history of the county, one cold calculation at a time. The departure from Pemberton Manor was not a retreat. It was a calculated withdrawal of presence. As the heavy doors of the estate swung shut behind them, the festive music was severed, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel and the distant, mournful call of a nightjar. The night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the approaching frost of late October, a sharp contrast to the hothouse humidity of the ballroom. Lydia did not wrap her arms around herself for warmth. She did not seek the gaze of Arthur Sterling as they moved toward the waiting carriage. She walked with her spine aligned to the vertical pillars of the portico, her breath a series of small, invisible clouds in the moonlight. The carriage of Arthur Sterling was not a vehicle of transport. It was a sanctuary of calculated silence. It was a massive, black lacquered construction that seemed to absorb the light of the lanterns. The interior smelled of expensive tobacco, ancient leather, and the cold, ozone scent of the winter to come. Lydia seated herself on the velvet bench, the fabric far softer than any she had touched in a decade. She smoothed the skirt of her plum-colored dress, the last year's lace, and waited. She did not ask where they were going. She did not express her gratitude for the social shield he had provided. She waited for the terms of the debt to be presented. Across from her, the Duke sat in the shadows, his face a landscape of hard angles, illuminated by the flickering light of the passing lamps. He did not remove his gloves. He did not lean back into the cushions. He sat with a stillness that suggested an individual who had mastered the art of waiting. The sterling signet on his hand caught a stray beam of light, a heavy gold anchor in the dimness. For several minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic strike of the horse's hooves against the road and the low creak of the leather suspension. "I assume you have questions, Miss Whitmore," Arthur murmured, his tone a deep vibration that seemed to ground the swaying carriage. His tone was not unkind, but it lacked the artificial warmth of the social world they had just left. It was the voice of a man accustomed to delivering reports. Lydia looked at him, her eyes steady. "I have a tally, Arthur Sterling. I am aware that you have just purchased a significant portion of my reputation from the hands of Julian Thorne. I am also aware that a man of your standing does not invest in a depreciating asset without a specific objective. You told me to pretend I was with you. I have fulfilled that role for the duration of a dinner. Now I require the duration of the contract and the nature of the labor required of me." Arthur tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement had it not been so clinical. "You speak as if we are negotiating a lease on a tenant farm. Most women in your position would be preoccupied with the scandal of the engagement or the sudden change in their fortunes. You, however, are calculating the interest rates on my intervention. I have spent the last 5 years auditing the remains of a bankrupt estate," Lydia replied, her voice level. She held his gaze. "I have learned that nothing is more expensive than a gift given without a stated price. To be saved by a duke is a social debt that could take a lifetime to repay. I prefer to settle my accounts early." Arthur leaned forward, the movement bringing him into the light. His piercing grey eyes were fixed on her with a sudden, sharp intensity. "You are correct. There is a price. I have a reputation in this county for being difficult, feared, as some would say. It is a useful tool for estate management, but a hindrance in other matters. My family's board of trustees is concerned with my lack of an heir and my perceived isolation. They threaten to invoke a clause in the entailment that would place Blackwood Manor under their direct supervision if I do not show signs of social stabilization by the year's end." Lydia nodded. She did not blink. "So I am the stabilization, a woman of good birth if poor fortune, who can act as the Duchess presumptive to satisfy a board of auditors. It is a logical solution, but why me? There are a dozen daughters of the peerage who would crawl over broken glass for the sterling signet." Arthur's mouth tightened. "Those daughters want the title. They want the jewels. They would spend the next 20 years filling my house with noise and my ledgers with debt. I saw you in that vestibule, Miss Whitmore. You did not cry. You did not scream. You counted the insults and weighed them against your own dignity. You are a woman who understands the value of silence and the necessity of order. I do not need a wife to love. I need a partner to govern." The carriage turned sharply, the wheels splashing through a puddle. Lydia felt the weight of the moment. She was being offered a kingdom, but it was a kingdom of stone and shadow. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. "I accept the terms of the pretense," she said. But I have one condition of my own. I am not a decorative object. If I am to be the mistress of Blackwood, I will not be a figurehead. I require access to the estate records. I am told your reputation for fear stems from the chaos of your finances, not the cruelty of your character. Let me audit the Blackwood ledger. Let me earn my keep by bringing order to the ruin your stewards have likely made of your accounts. The Duke's eyes narrowed. You wish to work? You would trade the ballroom for the counting house? To be idle is to be vulnerable, Lydia said, her spine straightening. I have no interest in being a guest in your home, Arthur. I intend to be its architect. The carriage came to a halt. The sound of the horse's breathing was loud in the sudden stillness. Arthur reached out and opened the door himself, bypassing the footman. He stepped out and offered her his hand. Very well, Miss Whitmore. Welcome to Blackwood Manor. Let us see if your mind is as sharp as your tongue. The arrival at Blackwood Manor was a sensory shift from the gilded pretension of the Pembertons. The house was a massive grey stone structure that seemed to grow out of the very bones of the earth. It was not a monument to wealth. It was a fortress of history. The air here was colder, smelling of pine needles, ancient stone, and the deep, damp silence of the forest. There were no hothouse lilies here. Only the stark geometry of the Tudor wings and the dark, unblinking windows that watched their approach. Arthur led her through the great hall, a space of soaring arches and shadows that the candlelight could not hope to touch. The servants were few and moved with a ghostly efficiency. The house felt like a clock that had been wound too tight, a mechanism of habit that had forgotten its purpose. She ignored the tapestries, she bypassed the armor, she observed the dust in the corners and the way the light failed to reach the ceiling. This way, the Duke said, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He led her to a pair of heavy, oak-paneled doors at the end of the east wing. He pushed them open, and the scent hit her immediately. The dry, peppery smell of old paper, the metallic tang of drying ink, and the cloying sweetness of beeswax. It was the library. The room was vast, the walls lined with thousands of leather-bound volumes that reached into the darkness above. But it was not the books that drew Lydia's attention. It was the desk. In the center of the room sat a massive mahogany table piled high with loose sheaves of parchment, unsealed correspondence, and thick, disorganized ledgers. It was a graveyard of neglected truth. The Blackwood ledger was not a book. It was a contract of neglected sovereignty. It lay at the center of the chaos, its leather binding cracked, its pages protruding at uneven angles. Lydia stepped toward it, her fingers itching with a familiar, professional hunger. She did not see the wealth of the room. She saw the insolvency of its management. She saw the reason Arthur was feared. He was an aristocrat who had delegated his power to those who had likely bled him dry in the shadows of his own silence. Arthur stood by the fireplace, his silhouette tall and jagged against the dying embers. My stewards have told me the estate is stable, he said, though there was a note of doubt in his voice he had not used in the carriage. They claim the tenants are dissatisfied because of the poor harvests, not the mismanagement of the tithes. Lydia did not answer immediately. She reached out and touched the top ledger. Her fingers came away black with dust. She opened the cover. The handwriting inside was a chaotic scrawl of conflicting entries and erased figures. She did not need more than 10 seconds to see the truth. She did not need an expert to tell her what her own eyes knew. Your stewards are liars, Arthur, she said, her voice echoing in the vast, cold room. They are not managing your estate. They are masking its decline. This ledger is a fiction. The numbers do not balance because they were never meant to. You have been looking for enemies in the parlors of London, but they are here in this room, hiding in the ink. The Duke moved toward her, his footsteps heavy. You can see this. After a single glance. I can see the grammar of a lie, Arthur, she replied, looking up at him. I have lived in the ruins of a house that looked exactly like this. You saved me from the fallout of a wedding, but I suspect I am the only one who can save you from this room. She sat down in the heavy chair, her plum dress rustling against the wood. She didn't resemble a guest. She didn't appear as an intended bride. She carried herself like a general taking command of a battlefield. She picked up a quill, her ink-stained fingers finding their natural grip. She did not ask for permission. She dipped the pen into the inkwell and made the first mark in a fresh column. The ledger was no longer a symbol of failure. It was the foundation of her new kingdom. Measured by the ticking of the clock, the night began to settle around them. Arthur did not leave the room. He sat in a chair across from her, watching the rhythmic movement of her hand as she began the long, silent work of restoration. There was no romance in the air, only the steady, intellectual pulse of two minds beginning to find a common frequency. The pretense was the contract, but the work was the reality. Lydia Whitmore had been cast out into the cold, but as she closed the first ledger of the night, she knew she had finally found the one place where her silence was not a weakness but a weapon. The midnight arc at Blackwood Manor did not burn with the flickering warmth of a celebratory hearth. It burned with the cold, steady intensity of a vigil. Lydia Whitmore sat at the massive mahogany desk, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the exhaustion that pulled at her eyelids. The library was a tomb of silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the long case clock and the occasional rasp of a quill against dry parchment. She had been in this room for 6 hours, and in that time, the geography of Arthur Sterling's world had shifted from a noble estate to a landscape of systematic theft. The Blackwood ledger lay open before her, its pages yellowed and brittle, smelling of damp wool and the bitter tang of iron gall ink. She sought no beauty in the numbers. She pursued no comfort of a balanced account. She hunted for the friction, the tiny, repeated inconsistencies that indicated a mind more interested in concealment than in stewardship. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper, her movements small and precise. Her fingers were stained with ink, a dark, permanent smudge across the knuckle of her forefinger that she did not attempt to wipe away. To Lydia, the stain was not a mark of labor, it was a badge of sovereignty. She began to construct a parallel record, a shadow ledger that stripped away the flowery language of the estate administrators and revealed the skeletal truth beneath. The figures were devastating. For 3 years, the costs of the manor's roof repairs had been recorded twice, once in the spring and once in the autumn. Yet, as she had entered the hall, she had noted the distinct, dark outline of a water leak near the east wing. The grain tithes from the northern farms were listed as lost to rot, yet the weather records she had found in the margins of a local almanac spoke of a dry, bountiful harvest. The administrators had not merely been incompetent, they had been predatory. They had used the Duke's reclusive nature, his feared silence, as a cloak for their own greed. They had told him the tenants were surly and rebellious to keep him from speaking to them. They had told him the estate was stable while they bled the capital from its veins. Lydia felt a cold, familiar anger rise in her chest, the same anger she had felt when Julian Thorne had tried to explain away his betrayal as a matter of economic necessity. Injustice, she realized, always used the same vocabulary. It spoke of inevitability and the burden of others' failures. She did not allow the emotion to cloud her judgment. She did not allow her hand to shake. She counted, she cross-referenced. She mapped the flow of gold from the sterling coffers into the pockets of men who bowed with practiced humility while they sharpened their knives in the dark. The quill in her hand was not a tool of writing. It was a surgeon's scalpel dissecting a corpse of lies. As she reached the final column of the third ledger, she found the catalyst for the Duke's current crisis, with the Board of Trustees, a massive debt disguised as a long-term investment in a failing shipping line, had been triggered. It was a debt that Arthur did not know he owned, one that would give the trustees the legal right to declare the estate insolvent by the first of the year. The timing was too perfect to be accidental. It was a calculated assassination of a legacy, carried out through the slow, patient ink of a bookkeeper. Lydia set the pen down and gazed at the fire, which had burned down to a pile of glowing orange eyes in the grate. She saw the structure of the trap, and for the first time since the wedding she saw the path to its destruction. Arthur Sterling entered the library just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy velvet curtains. He was still dressed in the black coat of the previous evening, his face pale and etched with the fatigue of one who had spent the night walking the boundaries of his own isolation. He stopped at the edge of the desk, his shadow falling across the open books. He did not ask if she had finished. He did not offer a morning greeting. He looked at the ink-stained fingers of the woman sitting in his father's chair and saw the weight of the truths she had unearthed. The administrators told me the shipping investment was a necessity to diversify the sterling holdings, Arthur stated, projecting a deep, gravelly rasp. They said it was a shield against the fluctuations of the land. Lydia did not stand. She did not raise her face with the softness he might have expected from a pretend bride. She tapped the shadow ledger she had created. The shield is a noose, Arthur. The shipping line does not exist. It is a shell, a phantom created to siphon the interest payments into an offshore account. You are not insolvent because of the land. You are insolvent because you trusted the men who told you. The land was dying. You have been a prisoner of your own silence, and they have been your jailers. Arthur moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. The light hit the dust motes in the air, turning the library into a golden cage. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the sterling signet glinting in the morning sun. For a long time, he did not speak. The silence was not the oppressive, fearful thing the village described. It was a silence of calculation, a quiet weighing of the evidence she had presented. He turned back to her, his storm-colored eyes searching hers. You realize what this means? To challenge the stewards is to challenge the Board of Trustees. It will be a war of ledgers, not of words. I have already begun the mobilization, Arthur, Lydia replied, her voice steady and clear. A matter of action, not of emotion. If you give me the authority, I will dismantle their fiction by the end of the week. But you must be prepared to stand with me. The pretense of our engagement is the only thing that gives me the legal standing to speak in your name. Are you prepared to let a woman in last year's lace tell the world that the Duke of Blackwood has been a fool? Arthur Sterling's mouth curved into the smallest, rarest of smiles. A sharp, cold flicker of genuine respect. I have been called many things, Miss Whitmore. A fool is merely a new entry in the ledger. Proceed. The morning brought with it the first test of their alliance. It came in the form of a tenant dispute that had been simmering for weeks. One the head steward, a man of oily manners and hidden agendas, had insisted required the Duke's immediate and harsh intervention. The issue concerned the grazing rights of a shepherd whose flock had supposedly encroached on the manor's primary hay fields. In the past, Arthur would have relied on the steward's report and ordered a fine that would have bankrupted the man. This morning, however, Lydia stood at the Duke's side in the vaulted entry hall, her spine as straight as the marble pillars that surrounded them. The head steward stood before them with a sheaf of papers, his voice a practiced drone of manufactured concern. It is a clear case of trespass, Your Grace. The boundaries are well defined in the 1805 survey. If we do not make an example of this shepherd, every tenant on the northern ridge will be emboldened to flout the estate laws. I have prepared the eviction notice for your seal. Arthur did not reach for the seal. He looked at Lydia. She did not speak immediately. She stepped forward, her movements measured, and held out a small, leather-bound book, the local parish map she had audited against the Blackwood records earlier that morning. She averted her eyes from the steward. She focused on the shepherd, who stood near the door, his hat clutched in his weathered hands, his eyes filled with the quiet, desperate dignity of the working poor. Sir, Lydia said, addressing the head steward, her voice echoing with a cool, authoritative precision. I find your interpretation of the 1805 survey quite fascinating, especially since the 1810 amendment, which redrew the northern ridge boundaries following the Great Flood, clearly states that the riparian grazing rights belong to the tenants in perpetuity. According to my audit of the parish records, it is not this man who is trespassing, it is the manor's bailiffs who have been overstepping the legal boundary by 10 acres. The head steward's face went a mottled, angry red. That is a technicality, Miss Whitmore, a minor clerical error that has no bearing on the Duke's authority. It has every bearing on the Duke's integrity, Lydia countered, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the sound of a final judgment. An error that results in the unlawful seizure of a man's livelihood is not clerical. It is criminal. Furthermore, I have reviewed the tithe receipts for the Northern Ridge. This tenant has been paying a reclamation fee for 2 years, a fee that does not appear in the Blackwood ledger, nor in any tax record I have found. Perhaps you can explain why this money has been collected in the Duke's name, but never reached the Duke's accounts. The silence that followed was absolute. The shepherd looked up, his expression shifting from despair to a stunned, cautious hope. Arthur Sterling did not move. He watched the steward, his slate-grey eyes narrowing as he saw the man's composure begin to crumble. He saw the sweat on the official's brow. He saw the way the man's hands trembled against his expensive wool coat. And then he looked at Lydia. He saw her standing there, a woman of no fortune and a mended dress, dismantling a decades-old system of corruption, with nothing more than her memory and a map. He did not need to see the ledger to know she was right. He could see the truth in the architecture of her logic. He stepped forward, his silver-headed cane clicking against the stone floor. "You will return the fees to this man in full by noon," Arthur said, his voice cold and final. "You will then surrender your keys to Miss Whitmore. She is currently conducting a full audit of the estate, and until she is satisfied that the accounts are balanced, your services are no longer required." "But, Your Grace," the steward stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "You cannot listen to her. She is a guest, a penniless woman with no understanding of our traditions. She is the woman who will be your Duchess," Arthur declared, producing a terrifying rumble that silenced the room. "And she understands more of this estate than you have ever allowed me to see. Leave us." As the steward retreated, his boots echoing with the sound of someone who had lost everything, the shepherd stepped forward. He did not know what to say. He looked at Lydia, and then he bowed, not the forced, fearful bow he usually gave, but a slow, deep gesture of profound respect. "Thank you, my lady," he whispered. "We were told the Duke was a hard man. We did not know he had a heart that could count so fair." Lydia watched him leave, her expression remaining calm and professional. She did not seek the Duke's praise. She did not celebrate her victory. She began to organize the papers on the table, her mind already moving to the next column of the audit. Gauged by the chiming of the village bell, the morning had been a success. But she knew the war was far from over. Arthur Sterling walked to her side. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the cold ozone scent of his presence. "You did not just save a shepherd, Lydia," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You saved my reputation. They think I am a monster because they wanted me to be one. You are the only person who has ever bothered to look at the numbers." "It is a matter of truth, Arthur," she replied, looking up at him. "Not of emotion. The numbers do not lie. People do. I suggest we return to the library. We have 3 more years of tithe receipts to examine before the trustees arrive for tea." The Duke looked at her then, and for the first time, the distance in his eyes was replaced by something else, a steady, intellectual light that matched her own. He did not say he was falling in love. He did not offer a romantic vow. He reached out and picked up the parish map, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. "Let us go then," he said. "We have a kingdom to restore." They walked back toward the east wing, their footsteps falling into a rhythmic, synchronized pulse. The house was still cold, still filled with shadows, but the air felt different. It felt like a clock that had finally been set to the correct time. She refrained from glancing back at the entry hall. She did not think of Julian Thorne or the wedding she had left behind. She thought of the ledger and the way the ink felt under her fingers, and the silent, private art of survival that was finally, truly beginning to build a home. The morning air in the village of Blackwood was not a greeting. It was a cold, damp interrogation. It smelled of wet stone, bruised apples, and the metallic tang of wood smoke that clung to the low-hanging mist. Lydia Whitmore stepped from the Duke's carriage with a precision that suggested she was measuring the very gravity of the earth beneath her boots. She did not seek the assistance of the footman. She did not adjust the heavy wool cloak that shielded the plum-colored silk of the gown known as last year's lace. To the casual observer, she was a woman of mystery, a common ghost elevated to the status of a duchess presumptive. But to the inhabitants of the village, she was an anomaly, a creature of poverty who now carried the authority of the Sterling signet in the form of a heavy, wax-sealed authorization for the autumn provisions. She did not walk with the hurried pace of a servant. She bypassed the shop windows without the longing of a pauper. She moved with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a clock, her mind already auditing the prices of grain and tallow displayed on the wooden boards of the market stalls. The village square was not a place of commerce. It was a theater of judgment, and she was its principal auditor. Information was the primary currency here, and gossip was the tax paid by the unwary. Lydia felt the collective gaze upon her, a pressure colder than the October wind. She saw Mrs. Gable standing near the baker's stall, her feathered hat a jarring splash of artificial green against the grey stone. The older woman's eyes were narrowed, her mouth a tight line of unresolved curiosity as she watched the beggar of St. Jude's navigate the square with the poise of an empress. Lydia reached the corner of the apothecary's shop when the rhythmic pulse of her walk was interrupted. It was not a physical barrier, but a shift in the atmosphere. A sudden, cloying scent of expensive lavender water that did not belong in the damp air of a working village. She stopped. She didn't turn her head immediately. She waited for the sound of the footsteps to resolve themselves, a shallow, uneven gait that lacked the heavy authority of the Duke's stride. She knew the sound. It was the walk of a man who spent his life chasing a status he could not quite afford to maintain. "Lydia," a voice said, a sharp, brittle sound that attempted to mask its own insecurity with a veneer of intimacy. Julian Thorne stood in the shadow of the stone archway, his navy driving coat fine but worn at the cuffs. He looked like a man who had spent the last 2 weeks trying to convince himself of his own victory. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with a predatory kind of desperation. He did not look like a happy groom. He looked like a man who had just realized that the gold he had traded his honor for was beginning to tarnish. He stepped forward, moving into the private radius of her path, his hand reaching out as if to catch her sleeve as he had done in the church vestibule. She did not flinch. She did not step back. She stood with her spine as straight as a ruler, her hands folded over the leather reticule that contained the Duke's estate records. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of an auditor, reviewing a fraudulent entry. She did not see a former lover. She did not see a man who had broken her heart. She saw a debt that was overdue for collection. "Mr. Thorne," Lydia said, her voice a low, level vibration that carried no trace of the humiliation she had endured at his wedding. "I find your presence in the village unexpected. I was under the impression you and Clarissa were still in the midst of your wedding festivities at Pemberton Manor. Or has the hospitality of your father-in-law already reached its limit?" Julian's mouth twisted into a sneer. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do not play the grand lady with me, Lydia. We both know what this is, this engagement, this sudden favor from the Duke. It is a pantomime, a strategic lie designed to save your pride after I left you. Arthur Sterling is a man of shadow and silence. He does not want a wife. He wants a decorative piece of furniture to satisfy his board of trustees. When the year turns, he will discard you back into the mud, and you will be twice the beggar you were before." He stepped even closer, the smell of the lavender water now suffocating. "I am here to offer you a way out. I have spoken to my father. We can find a small cottage on the Thorne estate. You can live there quietly. I will ensure you are provided for. You are always too clever for your own good, Lydia, but you do not belong in a duke's bed. You belong in my shadow." Lydia felt the cold logic of his arrogance hitting her. She expected no rescue from the Duke. She required no witness. She analyzed Julian's coat. The fine navy wool that she now knew, from her audit of the parish debts, had been purchased on a line of credit set to expire in 30 days. The offer was not an act of mercy. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the respect of a woman who was his intellectual superior. "You speak of shadows, Julian, because you are terrified of the light," Lydia replied, her voice dropping an octave. "You believe the Duke will discard me because you cannot imagine a relationship that is not a transaction. But you are mistaken. Arthur Sterling did not give me a cottage. He gave me the keys to a kingdom you have spent your life failing to understand." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small, folded sheet of parchment. It was not a love letter. It was a summary of the Blackwood ledger's findings regarding the Pemberton shipping interests. She did not hand it to him. She held it just out of his reach, the Sterling signet on her finger catching the grey light. "The Duke whispered a pretense to save my name," she continued, her words rhythmic and sharp. "But I have spent the last fortnight turning that pretense into a reality of mathematics. While you were celebrating your union with Clarissa's dowry, I was auditing the very shipping lines that funded it. Did you know, Julian, that the Pemberton debt trap is not unique to the Sterling estate? Your new father-in-law has used the same phantom investment strategy to secure the mortgages on your family's land. By my calculation, The Thorne estate is currently operating on an insolvency margin of 12%. By the time the frost deepens in January, you will not be offering me a cottage. You will be asking the Duke for a loan to keep the roof over your own bride's head." The color drained from Julian's face, leaving him ashen. He stepped back, his eyes fixed on the parchment as if it were a weapon. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked around and realized they were not alone. Mrs. Gable had moved closer, her green feathered hat bobbing. The villagers had stopped their haggling. The silence was absolute. Lydia did not raise her voice. "You called me an insolvency, Julian. You told the parish the world was tired of carrying my debt, but you failed to realize that I am an auditor of lives as well as ledgers. I have measured you, and I have found your substance to be lacking. You traded a partner for a price tag, and now you find the price was a lie. You are the ghost, Julian. You are haunting a life built on a foundation of shifting sand." She did not wait for his response. She turned her back on him with a slow, deliberate grace, her spine as straight as a marble pillar. She walked toward the baker's stall, her plum-colored skirts rustling. She didn't glance back to see him standing alone in the archway, his expensive coat looking like cheap muslin in the presence of her absolute dignity. Mrs. Gable was waiting, her expression a mixture of shock and newfound respect. The older woman stepped aside, her green hat dipping in a gesture close to a curtsy. Lydia did not acknowledge the shift with a smile. She faced the baker and held out the wax-sealed authorization. "6 bushels of the fine white flour, if you please," Lydia said, her voice clear. "The Blackwood kitchens require the best, and the Duke is not a man who tolerates a lack of precision in his accounts." The baker bowed, his movements frantic. "Of course, my lady. As His Grace commands. As you command." Lydia stood by the stall, her hand resting on the wooden counter. The wood was rough, yet it felt more substantial than the silk ribbons of the Pemberton ballroom. She did not think of the coldness of the church or the whispers in the pews. She thought of the library at Blackwood Manor and the silent private art of survival that had finally truly become her sovereignty. Gauged by the chiming of the village bell, the confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes. But in that time, the geography of the county had been rewritten. The beggar had become the auditor, and the groom had become the debtor. Lydia Whitmore did not need the Duke to stand beside her to prove her worth. She had used the logic of the world that tried to crush her to build a fortress of her own making. As she watched the baker weigh the grain, she felt a sense of ordered peace. The ledger was finally beginning to balance, and she was the one holding the pen. The carriage was waiting at the edge of the square, its black lacquered panels reflecting the light. She walked toward it, her movements synchronized with the rhythmic pulse of the morning. She avoided searching for Julian Thorne or Clarissa. She fixed her gaze on the horizon, where the dark, jagged silhouette of Blackwood Manor rose against the pale sky. It was no longer a prison, it was a kingdom, and its architect was going home. Arthur Sterling was waiting inside the carriage, his winter-grey eyes watching her. He did not ask what had transpired in the square. He looked at her straight spine, her ink-stained fingers, and the way she held herself. He reached out and opened the door, his hand steady. "The village seems unusually quiet this morning, Lydia," the Duke observed, his baritones a steady rumble that grounded the swaying carriage. Lydia seated herself, her plum dress settling into the cushions. She did not offer a detailed report. She looked at him with the same clarity she used to evaluate a harvest. "It is a matter of perception, Arthur," she replied, her voice steady. "The villagers have simply realized that the accounts of this county are being audited by a new hand. I believe the interest rates on certain social debts have become quite prohibitive." The Duke's mouth curved into a sharp, cold flicker of respect. He did not say he was proud. He reached out and picked up a ledger that lay on the seat beside him, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. "Let us return to the work then," he said. "The trustees arrive tomorrow, and I believe we have a few more entries to correct before the accounts are finalized." The carriage moved into the shadows of the forest, the rhythmic strike of the horse's hooves echoing the steady beat of Lydia's own pulse. The house was still cold, but the air felt different. It felt like a clock that had finally been set to the correct time. Lydia Whitmore did not look back. She did not think of the man she had once intended to marry. She thought of the ledger, and the truth, and the silent, private art of survival that was building a home. The morning sun over Blackwood Village Square offered no warmth. It provided only a pale, crystalline illumination exposing the frozen cobblestones and every whispered calculation of its residents. Lydia Whitmore did not shrink from the cold. She stood at the center of the market cross, her ledger resting upon a stack of coarse grain sacks as though it were the altar of an unforgiving religion. The village, which had once turned its collective back on her mended lace, now watched her with a silent, breathless tension. The scent of wood smoke hung heavily in the air, mingling with the tang of impending snow. Martha Gable paused halfway across the square, her woven basket forgotten. She, like the rest of the village, had expected the destitute woman from the wedding to remain hidden in the Duke's shadow. Instead, they found a woman wielding the sterling authorization, a wax-sealed document resting beside her inkwell, its blood-red promise serving as an undeniable anchor of authority. Julian Thorne arrived not to trade, but to preen. He stepped from a polished carriage, intent on reminding the tenant farmers of his dominance. His boots struck the frozen ground with arrogant rhythm, but Lydia's spine remained a perfectly vertical line of defiance. "You have no right to freeze the Thorne grain shipments, Lydia." Julian sneered, stepping into her radius to rally the watching villagers. "You are overstepping the bounds of a mere houseguest. The Duke will not protect a beggar who interrupts legitimate commerce to soothe her own wounded pride." She refrained from raising her head immediately. She dipped her quill into the ink, made a precise notation, and raised her eyes. They were as cold as the morning frost. "Commerce requires capital, Julian," Lydia said, her tone a measured force. "A commodity your family has thoroughly exhausted." She turned the ledger so the village could see the unbroken columns of ink. "I have audited the Thorne accounts alongside the village tithes. You are operating on a 12% insolvency margin. The grain you attempt to ship today is heavily mortgaged against the sterling tenant fees you illegally diverted over the past 3 years. To allow this wagon to leave Blackwood would not be trade. It would be theft." The square fell into a suffocating silence. A 12% insolvency margin was a death sentence in the rigid hierarchy of their world. A whisper cascaded through the onlookers, carried on the breath of Mrs. Gable, who nodded with shrewd understanding. The social arithmetic of the village rearranged itself in a heartbeat. The beggar was gone. In her place stood the auditor of their collective fates. Lydia turned her attention to the gathered merchants. "The Duke's authority is absolute. All legitimate commerce will proceed under the sterling seal. Any debts owed by the Thorne estate to the village will be reconciled from their impounded assets. You will not suffer for his mismanagement." Julian took a step backward, the facade of his arrogance crumbling. He opened his mouth to deploy the cruel mockery used at the wedding. But the sheer weight of the mathematics had stripped him of his power. The villagers now turned away, aligning themselves with the undeniable truth of the ledger. Lydia did not revel in the humiliation. It was a matter of mathematics, not of revenge. She closed the book, handed the transit papers to the head teamster, and stepped back into the carriage. She was no longer a victim of a broken engagement. She was the architect of their economic survival. The air in the main hall of Blackwood Manor on the evening of the final audit smelled of aged mahogany, fresh ink, and the ozone of a winter storm gathering beyond the battlements. Lydia stood at the top of the grand staircase, her spine a vertical line ignoring the silence below. She did not wear the new silks Arthur Sterling had offered her. She wore the plum-colored gown, the last year's lace, its mended cuffs a quiet, defiant record of her own survival. The lace was not a garment. It was a testament to every night she had spent by a guttering candle, refusing to let poverty fray her spirit. To the trustees gathered in the hall, she was merely a temporary resident of a failing house. But as Lydia descended the steps, she saw a collection of unbalanced accounts, and she was the only one in the room who knew how to reconcile them. The trustees were led by Julian Thorne, standing with a practiced ease that failed to mask the predatory glint in his eyes. Beside him stood Clarissa Pemberton, her pearls catching the candlelight with a cold artificial shimmer. They had come to see the feared Duke of Blackwood dismantled by law, and Lydia Whitmore returned to the mud. Julian watched her descent with a smirk, his fingers twitching as if already counting the coins from the Duke's ruin. Lydia knew Arthur Sterling was a shadow in the corner, his chilling grey eyes watching the proceedings with the stillness of a predator. She reached the centre of the hall and signalled a servant. A massive oak table was brought forward, and upon it Lydia placed the Blackwood ledger and her own shadow ledger. The sound of the heavy books hitting the wood silenced the assembly. "Julian," Lydia began, her voice carrying the authority of a judge. "I understand you and the trustees are here to discuss the Sterling shipping debt and the subsequent motion for the seizure of the Blackwood estate. Before you proceed with your legal claim, it is a matter of administrative necessity that we examine the mathematics of your accusation." Julian's mouth tightened. "Estate management is a science of law and capital, Lydia, not a hobby for the destitute. The debt is documented. The shipping investment has failed. Arthur Sterling is insolvent by a margin that precludes his continued stewardship." Lydia did not flinch. She opened the shadow ledger, her ink-stained fingers moving with rhythmic precision. "The debt you speak of, Julian, was not an investment. It was a shipping debt trap, a contract of systematic extraction. You claim the Sterling coffers owe £40,000 to the Pemberton line for a fleet of vessels that supposedly foundered off the coast of Spain. However, I have spent the last 3 nights cross-referencing the maritime registries with the 1810 Boundary Amendment and the Pemberton shipping summary." She looked directly at Clarissa Pemberton, whose face shifted from triumph to pale, sweating unease. "There was no storm off the coast of Spain in the spring of last year, Clarissa. In fact, there is no record of the vessels your family claimed to have built ever being commissioned. The £40,000 did not vanish into the sea. It was rerouted through a series of reclamation fees into a phantom account used to secure the mortgages on the Thorne estate. You did not lose the Duke's money. You stole it to pay for your own dowry and to cover Julian's gambling debts." The silence was a vacuum of social collapse. Julian's hand dropped from his wife's waist. Clarissa's shallow gasp was swallowed by the vastness of the hall. Lydia turned a page in her ledger, her movements as methodical as the ticking of a clock. Furthermore, Lydia continued, auditing the trustees with a steady gaze. "You signed the authorization for these phantom investments. According to fiduciary duty laws, a trustee who knowingly facilitates the embezzlement of a ward's capital is subject to immediate forfeiture of his own standing. I have prepared the necessary documents for the magistrate, including the 1810 Boundary Amendment, which proves the land you attempted to sell last month was never yours to alienate. By my calculation, it is not the Duke who is insolvent. It is you, Julian. The Sterling estate will reclaim its interest in full." Julian took a step back, his face a mottled, angry red. "This is an outrage. You are a beggar. A woman of no standing making accusations that would ruin the finest families in the county." "I am an auditor," Lydia replied in a register of absolute finality. "And the numbers do not care about the length of your pedigree. They only care about the truth. The Blackwood ledger is now balanced. The theft has been recorded, and the debt you intended to use as a weapon has become your own cage." From the shadows, Arthur Sterling stepped forward. He walked to Lydia's side, his presence a massive weight of black wool and cold iron. He placed his hand on the shadow ledger, his sterling signet catching the light of the hearth, and looked at Julian with a terrifying silence. "I believe you were discussing my isolation, Julian," Arthur noted, his words a steady rumble. "Miss Whitmore has shown me that my silence was a weakness that allowed men like you to flourish. That weakness is now reconciled. You will leave my house, and you will leave the papers you brought. My solicitor will be in contact regarding the restitution of the stolen funds. Until then, you are no longer welcome on Blackwood land." The withdrawal of the guests was a frantic, silent exodus. Julian looked at the floor, his posture broken, realizing too late that the woman he had called an insolvency was the only thing that could save him. As the heavy oak doors finally closed, the sound echoed through the house like the final entry in a closing account. The house grew quiet. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Lydia remained at the desk, her hand still resting on the ledger. She began to close the books. "The work is finished, Arthur," Lydia said steadily. "The trustees will not trouble you again. I have prepared the instructions for the new stewards and the summary for your solicitor. I believe I have fulfilled the terms of our contract." Arthur Sterling walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit forest before turning and moving into the private radius of her isolation. "The contract we signed in the carriage was a matter of strategy, Lydia," Arthur explained, sounding surprisingly gentle. "It was a document created to satisfy a room of fools. It was not a literal thing. It was a shield. But shields are meant to be discarded once the war is won." He picked up the handwritten agreement, holding it over the dying embers, until the parchment caught a spark, curling into dark ash. The pretense was gone. "I have spent my life surrounding myself with stone and silence, believing they were the only things that would not betray me," Arthur said, his winter-grey eyes filled with unblinking respect. "I was wrong. The stone was a cage, and the silence was a lie. I ask you to stay, because I cannot imagine the stewardship of this estate, or of my own life, without the clarity of your mind beside me. I do not want a pretend bride. I want a partner. I want the woman who saw my ruin and chose to build a kingdom from it." Lydia looked at Arthur Sterling with the clarity she used to evaluate a harvest, seeing a partner who had finally been truly seen. She reached out, her ink-stained fingers finding their natural home against the cold gold of the Sterling signet on his hand. "A matter of action, Arthur," she whispered, "not of emotion. If I am to stay, the ledger must be balanced every day. There will be no more secrets in this house, no more shadows. We will be the architects of this home. Together." Arthur Sterling inclined his head. "Together," he repeated. The Blackwood ledger was not just a book of numbers, it was a map of a kingdom reclaimed. She closed the final book, the sound a soft thud in the stillness. The accounts were settled, the truth was established. Lydia Whitmore did not cry. She stood, her spine as straight as a marble pillar, and walked beside Arthur Sterling toward the heart of their home. The ledger of their lives was finally in perfect balance.